All right, welcome to my podcast. Today's guest is Richard Yetter Chappell, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Miami. His research focuses mostly on consequentialist ethics, as well as applied ethics and meta-ethics. And the reason I've invited him is that he announced a paper called Why Not Effective Altruism, which is forthcoming in Public Affairs Quarterly. Now, effective altruism is a rapidly growing movement, but in virtue of that, perhaps it has received a lot of criticism in recent years. And yeah, I would really love to hear from you why you decided to write this paper. Welcome on this podcast, of course.
All right, thanks very much for having me. Yeah, so I guess the thing that was motivating me here was that I'm personally very drawn to the ideas behind effective altruism. I think there are a lot of very good ideas there. And so I've just been quite struck by the just the sort of degree of hostility that some of that seems to have motivated in certain quarters. The sort of strength of the backlash has been very striking to me. And it sort of made me wonder, are these criticisms justified? Like, how strong are the objections that people have to it? But when I go and read the sort of things that are written in sort of public venues about people railing against effective altruism, by and large, the objections struck me as very bad. And so I thought, well, okay, this is a good opportunity for writing a paper where I can explain why I'm not convinced by those objections, and why I think we should generally have a generally positive attitude towards the ideas of effective altruism. I'm also a fan of the movement generally, but my paper doesn't focus on that. It's really just focused on the philosophical principles guiding it, because I think that's sort of easier for philosophers to focus on, and we can sidestep some tricky empirical issues about, okay, you might disagree with certain priorities, think actually the most effective thing would be something else. I'm happy to leave that open. But the idea is that even if you disagree about some of the details, I really think everyone should think favorably of the idea of trying to help others more effectively.
Yeah, could you perhaps give a quick definition about what effective altruism means and what the movement is all about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is tricky to pin down because people do use it slightly differently. I think that the core idea is often the idea of sort of treating effective altruism as a kind of a project that you can engage in, where the idea is to be doing something that involves trying to help others as effectively as possible using the best available evidence. And this can partly involve sort of a research project, like trying to find out what are the best ways to help others. And then a crucial part of it is also putting it into practice and actually, to some extent, doing things that will actually help others.
Now, perhaps most controversially in the last 2 years, there has been this debacle with Sam Bankman-Fried, who has been associated with the movement. And now, in some of the criticisms that have been posted online, he's been described as this hedonistic utilitarian. And the criticism has sometimes been taken to imply, well, this proves utilitarianism is the wrong approach. And me as a bystander, more or less, to effective altruism, but as someone who is close to utilitarian thought, more or less, I thought, well, surely this isn't an argument that utilitarianism is wrong, but that his approach has been mistaken. Surely this wouldn't be demanded from utilitarianism. But yeah, perhaps you could give us there some answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think that the core thing there is that, utilitarianism as a theory tells us to do the thing that will do the most good. And so you look at Sam Bankman-Fried's, behaviors, and did that do the most good? No. And crucially, I mean, you might then shift to the expectational thing and say, well, okay, maybe he took a gamble and it just didn't pay off, but it was worth it in expectation.
Yeah.
And so a crucial question then is to assess, well, do you really think that if we could sort of roll back time and like play it over multiple times, like with slight variations, should we expect in most cases for someone to engage in like really high profile fraud or something with the aims of like getting more money to then donate, effectively engaging in stealing to give rather than earning to give? Is I think the concern here. Should we expect in like a sufficient number of cases that will actually lead to more good than harm overall? And I'm just very suspicious of that. I don't think we should expect that that normally would lead to better results, or that it would in a sufficient number of cases lead to better results, particularly when you take into account that the costs of his behavior are not just like, well, he lost some money and so good things didn't happen, but also there's a lot of negative costs. There's very obviously direct cost to the people who suffered as a result of his losing, stealing their money. But there's also the direct cost, the indirect costs to all of the causes that he was associated with that could potentially do a lot of good. So, a fewer people become excited about effective altruism. A fewer people decide to donate to save lives because they don't want to do something that seems similar to what Sam Bankman-Fried was interested in. That could lead to a lot more people dying, and that would be terrible. So I think there are just really big costs to behaving in these kind of underhanded, dishonest ways. And I think utilitarianism properly takes that into account, and properly prudent utilitarian will be very opposed to that kind of behavior.
So do you think his motivations were authentic, that he really tried to do what was most good?
I mean, I don't know. It would be interesting to, be able to look inside his head and know for sure. I mean, people are complex. My guess would be that there was probably a mix. I would be surprised if he wasn't at least partly genuinely concerned about trying to improve the world. It seems to me that he probably had some sincere interest in that. I've also seen some speculations that he might have been sort of lacking in empathy, and so people speculate there's kind of connections with psychopathy and so forth in terms of lacking empathy and understanding of other people's needs. And that's something that sort of deficit can go along with not taking risks appropriately into account, even in a rational kind of way. It can just lead to very irrational sorts of risk taking. And so I think that could potentially also be a big part of the explanation of the problem that arose there, which isn't purely coming from moral theory. That's weird personality stuff going on there. So I mean, I'm not equipped to really speculate about other people's psychology. This is just kind of off the top of my head, my rough impressions, but I could be completely wrong.
Yeah, it's hard to say, I suppose. But one argument you just made is that perhaps it shows that we can't be naive utilitarians. There has to be a more rigorous approach, perhaps. How would you describe that distinction?
Yeah, so a sort of classic way of thinking about it is that a naive utilitarian is someone who sort of looks at the utilitarian goal, maximizing well-being, and the idea of the sort of expected value calculation is the sort of rational way to implement that, and then tries to directly do that in each instance. So they come across any kind of decision, choice point in their life, and their response is to calculate, what would be the expected value of my acting in one way rather than another. And so they try to assign a value to each possible outcome, assign their best guess probabilities, multiply through the probability by the value of the outcome, and then just blindly do whatever that calculation suggests would be best in expectation. And I think that's a terrible decision procedure. I think basically every utilitarian philosopher who has ever written on the topic, like the entire history of philosophy, agrees that that is a terrible decision procedure. We are not good enough at assessing probabilities, at assessing outcomes, at accommodating our own biases to be able to implement a decision procedure like that reliably and actually get good results. It's very predictable that that kind of naive decision procedure would backfire and lead to problems. And so the standard kind of consequentialist utilitarian answer is to say we need to be more sophisticated in how we try to put utilitarianism into practice. We need to think about things like what kinds of character traits are good ones to have and to inculcate and to follow, what kinds of virtues will tend to lead to better results. And so there tends to be a lot more emphasis on things like actually behaving in ways that are cooperative towards others, that demonstrate honesty and integrity, that don't violate generally reliable norms and laws and rules. These kinds of dispositions can be very well motivated and justified on utilitarian grounds as ones that will tend to lead to better outcomes. And so we should support them and inculcate them and act upon them ourselves precisely for that reason, because they're so instrumentally valuable in bringing about a better world.
And the way we've now talked about effective altruism and utilitarianism, it might seem like the two views are almost identical, but that's certainly not right. Although perhaps often when people criticize effective altruism, there's almost a kind of guilt by association argument made that it's just secretly utilitarian, and utilitarianism is obviously evil, and hence effective altruism can't be good. How would you respond to that?
Yes, that's a very common argument. So I would dispute it at almost every point. So obviously, I don't think that utilitarianism is evil. I have a lot of sympathy for that theory. But even more importantly, you don't have to agree with utilitarianism to find a lot that's right in effective altruism. You can be a wholehearted effective altruist and completely reject utilitarianism. And the core reason for this is that utilitarianism involves this idea of, yes, trying to bring about more good, doing it efficiently. But the really distinctive thing, and the thing that's most controversial about utilitarianism, is it takes that to be completely exhaustive of ethics. There is nothing else that matters or that counts at all. So there's no intrinsic deontic constraints. If you could do more good by violating people's rights, in theory, you should. I've just said that in practice, we shouldn't try to implement that because we're not reliable enough. But if you had an oracle or somehow God told you that it really would save more lives for you to kill this one person and that would do more good overall and there'd be no backlash, no long-term bad effects, then that would be the better thing to do according to utilitarianism. Effective altruism is not committed to anything like that. It just says, as one life project you should have, potentially among many, you should try to do more good rather than less, all else equal. Right. And so that's compatible with thinking this is within the constraints of permissibility. If you think there are intrinsic moral obligations to not violate people's rights, that you have an independent understanding of rights that cannot be violated, that's fine. You can totally have that conception of rights and just say within the constraints of the permissible, do more good rather than less. So it's completely compatible with deontology in that respect. It's also compatible with personal prerogatives and partiality. So, realistically, nobody is perfectly impartial in the way that utilitarianism says would be morally ideal. We all have special concern for our friends and our family and ourselves. And many views want to say, actually, that's reasonable as well. It's not just like a kind of compromise with human nature, the way utilitarians think. It's actually, in some sense, right and proper that people care more about their own children than about strangers. And that's compatible with effective altruism too, right? It says there's totally room for you to care especially about your own family. It's just that you should have one project potentially among many that involves trying to do as much good as you can for others within the bounds of that. It could be a limited scope of your life, just within that scope of that project.
And so if we distinguish then effective altruism as perhaps the more general project of perhaps spending some of your income on helping people in, say, poor regions where your money might do more good than, say, giving it to a local charity, right?
Right.
Then what are the main objections here typically given or criticisms to effective altruism?
Yeah, so the four ideas that I really focus on my paper that I think have maybe gotten the most attention of people who are concerned about the ideas of effective altruism were it's focused on prioritization and considering trade-offs. The second was earning to give. The third was concerns around billionaire philanthropy. And the fourth is long-termism. So we can kind of step through each of these, I guess.
Yeah, let's go through each.
All right, so starting off with prioritization. This is one that people don't often really explicitly object to, but I think it's underlying a lot of concerns that people raise. So I think on the face of it, if you've got a choice between, two things and one of them does more good and one does less, seems like you should do the option that does more good. That's, it seems kind of hard to dispute that as a general principle. All else equal, it doesn't involve any rights violations or anything like that. It would just seem kind of gratuitous to choose to do less good when you could do more. But I think in practice, this actually seems quite offensive to a lot of people, partly because I think most of the time, I think we don't actually very often have a completely cause agnostic concern just to help others. I think very often we sort of latch onto a particular cause or a particular group that we're concerned about. You might start to especially care about cancer sufferers, cancer victims, perhaps as a result of some emotional connection, someone in your family who suffered from it or something. And so you start to think about, okay, we should particularly help people who are suffering from cancer, whatever particular cause you're linked to. And then if someone else comes along and says, well, that's certainly important, but notice that we could save 10 times as many people if we redirected that money from the cancer charity, if you instead donated it to this anti-malarial charity helping people in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And then I think that just comes across as a bit confronting to people. It's like, hang on, I'm doing this other good thing, and now you're like criticizing me and telling me I really should be doing something else that's
Right.
even better. And I think it can come across as a bit harsh to be like criticizing people for doing good things that are suboptimally good. And I think there's a real concern there. So one thing I flag in my paper is that I don't think we have to take effective altruism as like in a super critical way. You don't have to take it as saying that you're obliged to do the most good possible. I mean, I think there are interesting arguments for people who do argue for that, but we don't have to go that far. I think we can just say sort of within the realm of the supererogatory, there are all these good things, and it's just that you have more reason to do the more good. And I think that's enough to get off the ground with thinking effective altruism as a good project. And if that's so, I mean, I think we should probably be a bit careful about how we sort of engage with other good projects that are just not quite as good, maybe. The person who's supporting the cancer charity, they don't warrant any kind of criticism necessarily. But I think it's worth drawing to their attention a kind of invitation, like, yes, what you're doing is awesome, but notice there's something else you could be doing that would be even more awesome.
Right.
So,
So
consider it. What do you think?
the objection there, I suppose, then is a kind of liberal libertarian objection that as long as we don't harm anyone with our action, we are free to pursue whatever values we hold, whether we want to give money away to this charity versus another, or just spend it all on ourselves. And I suppose effective altruism then comes in and says, well, actually, that is a bit morally sketchy, and you should think more about where you should spend your money. So it is,
Yeah.
there is perhaps something inherently more paternalist where people perhaps feel like they're being interfered with and they don't like that.
Yeah, so I think that is a concern that people raise. So, again, I sort of try to suggest a way to sort of partly accommodate those concerns by being less, like, not too pushy about it, but there's still at least an invitation and a suggestion that there is more reason to do the better option over the less good one. I'm not going to try not to be too judgmental about it or anything, but it's just, let's encourage people to try to do more good.
Yeah, the way I sometimes saw the objections, though, it almost seems like there was an unwillingness to think about trade-offs at all, that there's a kind of just equality among causes and we should just give money to each. But certainly there's a limited amount of effort or time and money we can spend on all these potentially good causes. I mean, in the absence of trade-offs, we might just be in paradise, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems like, I mean, maybe there's just an unwillingness to think about trade-offs. I'm not sure.
I think there can be. I think it can sometimes be seen as a bit sort of socially taboo or something to be in any way critical about a good cause.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's a shame because, as you say, there are real trade-offs in the world, and we don't have infinite time and resources. We can't do everything that it would be good to do, and so given those limitations, we've got genuinely good reasons to try to prioritize and focus on the things where we can do the most good rather than less, given that we can't do it all. And so it's a real barrier to that goal. It's a real barrier to doing more good if people are not willing to consider the possibility that a good thing might not be as good as something else. And so we've got reason to, really look at the whole range of options and, be willing to shift from our initial assumptions and move on to a different cause if it would actually be better.
Yeah, let's get back to that later and perhaps move on to the next point. Which one was that?
Okay, cool. So the second, it's a very controversial idea from it's really been associated quite a lot with effective altruism, is this idea of earning to give, where the basic idea here is that we traditionally think of ethical careers as ones where you're directly doing good. So you can think of like doctors working in the third world, helping save lives, someone who works as a charity worker for an NGO, again, things where you're sort of on the ground doing good directly, some kind of sort of social sector job. And I think a really interesting idea that's sort of, I think, most associated with Will MacAskill, he sort of stressed it in his initial effective altruism book, Doing Good Better, had some articles and lots of discussion on the web about it, was this idea that it might be you might be able to do more good rather than becoming a doctor yourself by earning a lot of money and such that you could pay for 10 other doctors to go and work in developing countries. And that would do more good than just going yourself and nobody else sort of doing that extra donation that's required to actually pay for the whole system. And so there's this idea that we can indirectly do good by earning extra money and then donating it where it's most needed. And that's something we should recognize as sort of morally good, like a morally praiseworthy, a worthwhile job, a really ethical thing to do, to pick a high-paying job, as long as it's not doing a huge amount, like a great amount of harm itself.
Right,
It's
so
like a
why is
morally
that
neutral
seen
job.
as problematic?
Yeah, so this is the key thing. The key dispute is going to be, okay, but how do we trade off between the jobs, some harmful aspects of the job, and the good done indirectly? So one thing I stress in the paper, I think, is that the core idea of earning to give, I think, is just that if within the space of permissible careers, the ones that allow you to do more good indirectly are going to be more good. That's something that counts in favor of choosing such a career. So there's moral reason to choose the permissible career that would allow you to do the most good, and that includes via donations. So I think that sort of core idea seems somewhat indisputable to me. And it is a genuinely neglected idea that people just previously didn't have kind of on their radar, the idea that a high-paying career that's otherwise permissible, in order to take it and then donate a lot of the income you get from it, that would be a very ethical thing to do. That's a good option for altruists to consider if they could sustainably do it.
Is that because we just have perhaps the strong moral intuition that our moral psychology associates a kind of moral sacrifice with morality? That say, if someone is very poor and they give some money away, it shows a kind of greater moral virtue than if someone who's very rich and part of this huge company, even if they give away millions, it doesn't change their own life quality in any way.
Yeah, they're still comfortable.
Yeah,
I think that could be a part of it. So definitely a part of the reason could be the sort of association with self-sacrifice being necessary to really establish virtue in altruism. If someone's still comfortable after doing good, you can't really be sure what their motivations were. That could be part. I think another part could just be just that it's more vivid if someone is like directly hands-on, like directly causing good. And if you sort of imagine like heroic actions, we think of heroic ones as sort of directly doing the good. So a firefighter running into a burning building and rescuing people and bringing them out. And even if they weren't at any serious risk, like chance of death themselves, they were wearing good fireproof clothing and stuff. Still, the fact that they were hands-on saving lives seems very heroic to us. Whereas if you just sort of write a check and send it off and that saves lives, it just doesn't seem heroic in the same way, even though it maybe does just as much good, or maybe even more, because it might be less replaceable. If that firefighter hadn't been there, someone else would have taken the job, but there's no one replacing your checks if you don't write them to charities.
If you perhaps use a thought experiment, now in a lot of superhero comics and movies, superheroes are often these extremely smart individuals that invent all kinds of technologies, but then they often spend their own individual time fighting crime, stopping some burglary. Would effective altruists tell us they should instead invest all their time into developing perhaps some medical cures and transferring to save much more lives?
There's a very funny cartoon about sort of effective altruist criticism of Superman, that he's wasting all this time doing small scale crime fighting when he could just be spinning a turbine round and round and providing infinite free energy to the world. That would be vastly better. Less exciting for him. It's not, and I think this might be part of it as well, that there's a sense in which it feels more meaningful for us to be like interacting in a personal way with others, and so we get more out of it by sort of volunteering rather than donating, something like that. So it's nicer for Superman to be like saving crime victims and getting to like, take them back to their families and see how happy they are and how grateful to him they are. Whereas if he's just spinning a turbine in a dark room somewhere and doesn't get to really see the fruits of his labors, that's a lot rougher for Superman. But I think that would actually make it all the more altruistic for him to provide the world with free energy.
Yeah. I suppose another criticism that then comes in is that, trying to work in perhaps huge corporations that sometimes do morally dubious things, that isn't criticizing perhaps the underlying system, that there's a kind of systemic critique of effective altruism, that it almost cements the status quo.
Yeah,
that's
perhaps,
right.
So I think
could you elaborate on that critique?
Sure. So the worry is there's a kind of assumption in the background. So this tends to come from a quite sort of leftist anti-capitalist perspective, where the idea is that there's a certain, our current system is like thoroughly corrupt and terrible. The best thing we could do is to somehow overthrow it and make things very different. But insofar as effective altruists tend to work within the system, maybe even encourage people to, take these high-paid jobs, become billionaires if they can, and someone in that position is probably not going to be that motivated to critique it or undermine it. They're benefiting from the system themselves, as well as doing things within the system that benefit others they see as altruistically valuable. So effective altruists don't have a sufficient motivation to be like anti-capitalist revolutionaries. And so if you assume from the start that what we really should do is be anti-capitalist revolutionaries, effective altruism potentially undermines that, so effective altruism is bad. So I think that is a common kind of argument. I think the key sort of crux of the disagreement there might be this question of, should we be anti-capitalist revolutionaries? I tend to think, no, I think capitalism is there are ways it can be improved upon, but by and large, it's a sort of engine for growth and economic development and does a lot of good. And the alternatives, if you look historically, haven't done that much good for people. So it's partly just an empirical disagreement, I think, about what systems are actually good for the world. I do think in theory, effective altruism as a principle is completely open to the wide range across the political spectrum. Really, someone could be an anti-capitalist revolutionary, endorse effective altruism, and think it's possible that the very best thing we should do is to advocate for this systemic change. You could think even more important than donating to malaria, anti-malaria nets or something, is to donate to organizations that are going to bring about the systemic change we need, donate to the appropriate political parties, for example. And if you had sufficient good evidential backing for thinking that would have good results, then that could be the effective altruist thing to do. I just disagree empirically, but that's fine. People are allowed to disagree about what the best thing to do is. You could still think that that's what follows from the principles. So I don't think there's actually any sort of systemic barrier within the principles of effective altruism to pursuing systemic change. I think it really is just a matter of maybe being more the case that the kinds of people who are drawn to effective altruism maybe tend to, I don't know, have a bit more of a economic sort of mindset where such that they sort of agree more with traditional economists and less with the anti-capitalists. And so they just don't actually agree that the best thing to do would be to overthrow the system.
My wife had a Browning who's closely associated sometimes with EA. She was at this Global Priorities workshop at Oxford in the last 2 days, and she told me there was actually a talk on why EAs should actually try to embrace a kind of more anti-capitalist stance. So it's certainly not a case that all EAs are just completely pro-capitalism, a sort of unfettered capitalism.
I think it's completely open for people to have their own views about that.
In fact, according to her at least, the majority of effective altruists is quite left-wing. There is a strong moral commitment to helping the unfortunate, helping those who are worse off.
Definitely.
That doesn't seem right-wing, really.
No, I don't think it's right-wing at all. It may be associated a bit more with sort of, I think the dominant view would probably be something along the lines of kind of a center-left, like moderate Democrat kind of view, where, you want to help the worst off, but you don't think that overthrowing capitalism is the way to do it. So, it's shared goals, but just disputes about what the best way to achieve those goals is.
Yeah. I suppose it would cause maybe more internal turmoil if, instead of just figuring out how to spend perhaps philanthropic donations in the most effective way, instead the whole movement had to settle on which political parties had to be supported instead.
Yeah, I think that would be very difficult. So I think there are some advantages to the movement itself being kind of politically neutral, in the sense that, there's just scope for, people, whatever their political views are, to sort of take that on board and think that their attempts to pursue their sort of political goals is something that can be part of their effective altruism. But certainly the movement as a whole isn't going to take any sort of political stand and say this is the correct politics to have. I don't think that would be appropriate. There's room for people to disagree. I just think there's a lot of room for reasonable disagreement there.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes now on social media, EA is sometimes called a cult.
Right.
That there's people get cancelled if they have countervailing views. But there does seem to be quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of views in the movement.
Yeah. No, I think so. I don't really understand the cult criticism where it's coming from. I mean, it might be, yeah, I don't know. I mean, probably part of it is just that I think effective altruists as a whole do have some views that are quite unusual. So they tend to be much more likely than the general population to be concerned about artificial intelligence and sort of existential risks and these kinds of things. I don't think that's actually a result of any kind of like you know, people canceling you if you disagree or anything like that, but just a matter of, you know, maybe they've looked at these arguments in a bit more detail and actually found them convincing. And most people haven't actually really looked into it and just think it sounds strange. And so we'll just assume that anything that sounds weird must be false.
Yeah, I saw some things that perhaps effective altruists were being described by people who knew them as sometimes developing mental health issues because they would spend so much time trying to dedicate this to helping others and then neglecting more of themselves. And perhaps you could see that as cult-like, because for often cults they're described as, sacrifice yourself for the bigger movement. So in that sense, there's a weak, perhaps, similarity there.
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, I think my general sense, I mean, I'm not super involved in like actual like community groups or anything within EA. I'm really just interested in the ideas. My sense from like reading the EA forums and stuff is that there tends to be a fair amount of kind of awareness of the risks of burnout. And so people really trying to encourage others to like, don't be too hardcore about it. Make sure you are looking after yourself and like being sustainable, taking care of your mental health. But I do think there have historically been some particular organizations or groups within effective altruism that maybe haven't treated their employees well. I think a famous one was, I think, Leverage Research or something, and that one actually has been described as a bit of a cult. I don't know a lot of the details, but it sounded like some weird stuff happened there that I definitely wouldn't endorse. So there could be, you know, there's within a really big, you know, a big umbrella kind of movement, there's always room for, you know, individual organizations to do bad things, and that could well have happened. I wouldn't want to defend any that that had done so.
Yeah, one argument. So I'm, for instance, attracted by utilitarianism actually, qua its actually very dedicated political approach. Now, utilitarianism in terms of effective altruism is sometimes described as being this kind of politically neutral movement. But if you look at the origins with Bentham, it was extremely strongly motivated as a political movement. Bentham literally gave up on writing these philosophical treatises and just went into government to influence policy, get rid of laws he saw as being inefficient, that didn't help anyone. You had Benthamites then in government that tried to create new laws that would be
it's all focused
beneficial
on
for everyone. But yeah, perhaps in that sense, there has been now more of a disconnect with, I mean, if you think of effective altruism, at least by being partially connected to utilitarianism, that it's perhaps not putting so much emphasis on influencing legislation.
I'm not sure whether that's true. So I think there are just different strands, and, you know, different groups and organizations are focusing on different things. I think certainly there are significant sort of groups within effective altruism that are very interested in policy, public policy, trying to improve legislation. Their focus tends to be on things like pandemic preparedness, AI governance. So looking at sort of particular kinds of concerns about what could go wrong in the future and trying to make sure that our governments and our legislation is sort of prepared to deal with that. So trying to find that low-hanging fruit for really improving things. So I think part of the difference might be that effective altruists don't tend to focus on the hot button political issues that most other sort of political partisans are really focused on. But that's partly because they're very explicitly looking for the kind of neglected topics where you can have a really high impact. If you can sort of get better laws passed on this neglected area. I think there's probably just a sense that, you know, if you come in on some really high profile like dispute where the two halves of the country are kind of already in at each other's throats over this, trying to just add like one more voice to that pile on either side, whichever you think is the right one, is probably not going to make a huge difference. I mean, I don't want to be too strong about claiming any of that, though, because I mean, if you actually think back to Sam Bankman-Fried himself, you know, not that we particularly want to claim him as an effective altruist anymore, but back when it seemed like he was partly being guided by those principles, one of the big things he did was donate billions of dollars to Biden's election campaign to try to make sure that Trump didn't get reelected. And I think that's very plausibly a very high impact, important thing for the world. So I think there's a general awareness that, you know, politics can be very important. There was an interesting effort by some effective altruists to actually try to get an effective altruist elected to a state legislation. Carrick Flynn, I think was his name, but it just didn't turn out very well. He wasn't popular with the voters, and so it didn't work. But
I mean, Peter Singer himself actually, I think, tried to run for the Greens Party in Australia at some point, but he didn't get elected. But maybe there are actually attempts by EA adjacent folks to have an impact in politics.
Yeah, I think it's just very difficult. It's difficult to achieve, but it does seem worth trying. I agree, and I think some people are trying.
So let's move perhaps to the next major criticism of EA. What do you talk about in your paper?
The third one was billionaire philanthropy. So this sort of ties in with some similar issues to the sort of concerns you raised with earning to give when it's associated with sort of maintaining current systems. So I think that's a big worry people have about billionaire philanthropy as well, that you're sort of giving too much power to a limited number of people. And really what we should want is for there to not be billionaires at all. That's possible. So what I say in the paper here is just to flag that I think we really need to differentiate between sort of what would be the ideal world if you were like starting from scratch, like what should the kind of ultimate endpoint be that you're wanting to achieve, and then distinguish that from the question of what should someone in our present circumstances do to improve things. And there's just not any guarantee that the thing to do is to try to make things look as close to the endpoint as possible. There could be kind of local maxima that you can achieve much better, and that if you tried to get to the global maximum over there, you'd actually end up way down in a ditch where things were much worse. So I think we just need to be careful about which question we're asking. And so insofar as one of the important questions is, you know, there are billionaires out there, they exist. What should they do? The standard thing for billionaires to do is to buy super yachts and, you know, do all kinds of like luxury consumption for themselves. Effective altruists think it would be much better if those billionaires donated their money to really worthwhile things to make people's lives better. Sometimes they do engage in philanthropy, but the standard kind of philanthropy is to get their name on a building somewhere, donate lots of money to Harvard so that they can have a building at Harvard named after them. That doesn't seem very good. Seems we could do better. And so effective altruists are interested in trying to encourage billionaires to use their resources better. And again, I just think like that seems completely indisputable, that between the options of like billionaires spending their money on themselves or on these very sort of, you know, self-centered, egotistical forms of philanthropy, or donating instead to actually effective global causes, we should want them to do the latter. Everyone should want that.
Right. Yeah. When I see social media criticism sometimes of billionaires, millionaires giving the money away, it almost seems like, what would you want them to do? What are you achieving here by demonizing effective altruism? The world you're achieving then presumably would be one in which billionaires would just keep their money to themselves or spend that on not helping those in need.
Yeah, because they're not criticizing so much the billionaires who just quietly, you know, spend money on themselves. It's the ones who do at least some good to suddenly like open themselves up to all this criticism. And it seems like bad incentives to be criticizing the billionaires, the few billionaires who are actually doing the best.
So why is there this, I don't know, slogan sometimes being given as of EA being dangerous, when if you just look at the outcomes that have been achieved, perhaps take away the controversial discussions about how we should think about the AI and artificial intelligence and how that might perhaps eradicate humanity or whatever. But it's just, you just look at the numbers of how many lives have been saved, diseases cured, and etc.
Yeah.
It seems almost insane how much good has been done already.
Right, yeah. I mean, so I think donors associated with effective altruism have saved something like 200,000 lives, mostly from anti-malaria charities, and then funded other very significant global health and development causes, deworming, all these kinds of things, in addition to just saving lives. There's a lot of money has gone into animal welfare initiatives to try to reduce the harms from factory farming, which are absolutely massive and very neglected from other donors not paying nearly as much attention to it. And a lot of this good comes specifically from the organization, the foundation Open Philanthropy, which is billionaire funded. It's one of the co-founders of Facebook, and his partner, his wife, together donate to created this foundation basically. And I just think they've done more good for the world than like almost anyone else I could imagine. I mean, who are you going to point to who's done more good than that? However bad you think Facebook is, I mean, they're not controlling it anymore. They just helped found it and got some of the very valuable shares, I guess. It's just very clear that they've been a force for good in the world. Now, I think there are interesting questions. I mean, one worry people have is as you raised before, this worry about, well, if billionaires are being so useful to the movement, is it then going to kind of reinforce capitalism and not try to fight for a more egalitarian kind of state? And I don't really know why that would necessarily be the case. So again, I'm personally generally in favor of a number of sort of pro-market kind of views, but I also like redistribution as well. Other people can be effective altruists and be much more left-wing than I am. They could think, we should really have vastly more sort of state interference in the economy. We should really want to nationalize all of these industries. You could think that. And you could also think, but before we do that, if it's not being done yet, in the meantime, while there are these billionaires, we should want them to spend their money as effectively as possible, and then try to bring about a future where there are no billionaires. You could think that, there's no barrier to combining those two views.
I wonder if psychologically just the spread of effective altruism would actually make it more likely that there is an endorsement for, say, some tax increases on the richest to redistribute, actually. I don't really see that as being incompatible. If anything, it creates more of an incentive that people should actually spend more of their income on helping those less fortunate, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you have more of a focus on, helping others in general, then it does seem, insofar as you think one seemingly salient way to achieve that could be just through more redistribution through the state, then that's natural to think there could be more support for that.
Yeah, so perhaps let's move to the fourth big objection, long-termism.
Right, so this is a big controversial one, I guess.
Maybe explain it. What does it mean?
Sure. So the core idea of long-termism is that a major priority a key moral priority of our time should be to try to protect and promote better results for the very long-term future, where that doesn't just mean things like the next, couple of decades away. It doesn't even just mean 100 years from now. It means the entirety of the future, potentially, 1 billion years from now, if humanity lasts that long. There could be a lot of people out there, and it's worth trying to ensure that they have good lives. Now, obviously, we can't do anything that directly affects what's going to happen 1 billion years from now. Like, you can't predict what's going to happen and like make changes that are changing things 1 billion years away. But the way it generally works is that long-termists say, taking into account the stakes, the kind of importance of the long-term future, makes it really clear that it's important that we don't do things now that threaten the potential of the future. So this is where the focus on existential and extinction risks comes in. So this thought that if there are things that could cause humanity to go extinct, like within this next century, then that would cause a loss of all that potential future value. And that would be like literally the worst thing ever by many, many orders of magnitude. And so it's worth really focusing on trying to reduce that risk of extinction, or of trying to even more so reduce the risk of like locking in a dystopia. So you could imagine if like some kind of very powerful kind of AI powered totalitarian dictatorships just allowed people to like this like small group of people to like take control and oppress everyone else in existence, and they could just maintain power and no one else ever had a chance to overthrow them. They're just sort of locked in this dystopian state. That could be terrible. If it could last for the entirety of the future, then locking in a really bad state like that would be like the worst thing that could possibly happen. And so it's worth trying to think about how can we make sure that none of those really, really bad things become more likely to happen as a result of things we're doing in the next few decades.
And so why is long-termism then so controversial?
Good question. So I think one big part of it is just this is a case where people are aware of trade-offs. And so, insofar as we have a limited amount of funding, and effective altruists as a group, for example, have a limited amount of funding, the more focus that they put on things like trying to develop AI safely so that it doesn't end up, maintaining dictatorships or something like that. Or the more money that goes into that kind of research is less money that's going towards global poverty or other sort of immediate needs. And so part of it is just a worry about, well, hang on, isn't global poverty really important? If you're focusing on this other thing that's like mere speculation, we don't even know that it's really going to be an issue. It's possible that all of this research will turn out to be a total waste and completely unnecessary. And I think it tends to tie in with a certain degree of certain kind of suspiciousness of the motives of the people involved. So sometimes it's put in terms of like, well, money going to global poverty helps people in Africa, helps Black people. The money going towards AI research is helping white Europeans, and so you're paying these researchers, these very privileged people are the ones being helped by effective altruism now, rather than the world's most sort of people who are more in need. And so there's a sense that there's some kind of bad motives that are maybe leading the long-termists to be wanting to like privilege people like them in a sort of selfish way, rather than actually doing good for the world, and that it's all just kind of a scam. I think that's a very common criticism that one hears in certain areas, a sense that there's something a bit of a scam here.
Yeah. I suppose one of the arguments I often see, though, is that we actually shouldn't care about future humans in the same way we care for us. Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, so that's a second kind of avenue of argument. So one is this sort of, this more sort of political suspiciousness. It's just a scam accusation. The second is this idea, a more sort of philosophically principled idea, that actually extinction isn't bad. We shouldn't care if there is no future. The only people that matter are the ones that already exist. And if we do things that cause extinction, it's just not that big a deal, so we shouldn't care that much. I think that's a terrible, terrible view. We can go into a bit of detail about why if you want, but I mean, I think most people initially, I would hope would sort of recognize that extinction would be a pretty big deal and a bad thing. I guess maybe two things to flag in response to the skepticism about how bad extinction is. One is that this actually isn't sufficient for rejecting long-termism, because as I mentioned, the two big kind of concerns that long-termists have, extinction is only one of them. The second big concern is that the future could be bad. And if we had a dystopian future, then there are people existing and suffering, right? And so I think any philosophical view has to recognize that like an eternal dystopia of future suffering would be really, really bad, and that we have strong moral reasons to prevent that from happening if there's any real risk of that. And so, yeah, again, even if you sort of accept the weird views in population ethics, which says that bringing people into existence doesn't matter, all that matters is the people that do exist, that's still enough to get long-termism off the boat, because we have to care about making sure that those future generations aren't suffering in dystopia. And even if you don't think it's the most likely outcome, any sort of risk of that sort, I think, does need to be taken into account to some extent. Just like when you're thinking about, nuclear weapons, nuclear power plants, and so forth, we want there to be sort of safety engineers to ensure that even if there's a low risk of a meltdown of a nuclear power plant, we want to minimize those risks, because it would be so bad if it exploded. And I think we have to think there's similar kinds of ways about technologies like AI, that even if there's a small risk of it, causing, terrible political upheavals and reinforcing totalitarian dictatorships, even if that's a small risk, it's one that's worth trying to minimize.
Yeah, someone who's largely attracted to utilitarianism and effective altruism more for left-leaning reasons, it's that it's really trying to give voices to individuals that are not only marginalized, but that perhaps can't raise their voices at all. So
Absolutely.
Take animals and future generations. I mean, it's really hard to find people in the animal movement. Now, there has been a lot of criticism of, say, the effective altruism utilitarian approach to animal ethics. But now, a lot of the literature I actually think is very bad or in that subject, when they often seem to try to say what's good for animals without actually paying attention to what the animals themselves want. So for instance, take animal welfare science. That's sometimes criticized as being almost inherently utilitarian, because what animal welfare scientists are trying to do is empirically investigate what animals like, what brings them pleasure, and then try to make the environments more aligned with that in order for them to get what they want and have high welfare, good health. But then
that seems important.
right. And then you
What's
get
the objection?
Animal welfarists saying, well, but if they're not in the natural environments, in the wild, say, then their welfare is intrinsically harmed.
I see.
Even if the individual animals would always choose the other place, right? So there are these strong criticisms of, for instance, zoos, right? And now many zoos are bad. They have very small enclosures and the like. But the argument that zoos must inherently be wrong, which has sometimes been brought forward, I can't really get behind that, because for many animals in good zoos, their lives there are great compared to life in the wild. They don't have to worry about predators. They get medical treatment. They get ready food supply. They often get to pick the food items they prefer the most. They're given a vast range, and they just quickly try to pick what they prefer the most. But there has been this recent book, which I think has been called "The Good It Promises, the Harm It Does," criticizing effective altruism, or at least quite a title. But then most of the chapters have been against the effective altruist approach to animals. And now that's a bit of a side tangent, but I saw that you actually wrote a critical review of that book. Perhaps you could give us a quick gist of that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the book was pretty terrible, to be honest. So yeah, I mean, people can find my review of it. It's just on my blog if they want to look it up. I mean, a general sense I got there was that, for the most part, I mean, the book just didn't contain arguments that supported the idea that effective altruism was being harmful in its approach to animal ethics. And so it wasn't kind of grappling with the aims of the movement on its own terms. It rather seemed like there was a lot of a focus on how animal activists were not being able to do what they wanted to do anymore, that their priorities weren't being listened to. So there was worries about kind of silencing the people who are working for animal charities because they had to do things that the funders thought would be best for the animals, and no longer doing what they thought made for like a good working environment for them. So one thing I found very puzzling about it was there seemed to be this message that, you know, the purpose of animal charities isn't actually to help animals, it's to like make a nice working environment for animal activists. And that just seemed like a completely backwards sort of perspective. It seemed very strange to be, you know, accusing effective altruism's animal wing for focusing too much on helping animals. Just seemed like a silly criticism. And then, so I guess a lot of it just seemed to be coming from a perspective that didn't seem to be grappling with what actually matters here, as far as I could tell.
Yeah, I mean, when they object to animal welfare scientists and their approach, it almost seems also a bit that they're anti-science there in their criticism. Whereas effective altruists, they try to, perhaps too much, right? Perhaps too much try to defer to scientific authorities, perhaps don't question that enough. Perhaps there are undue influences, say, in virtue of who is funding particular scientific research communities, right? Perhaps there could be an argument like that made, but that's at least something you could try to critically investigate.
Right. Yeah, so I think one sort of disappointment of the book was that I think a lot of effective altruists were really hoping that there would be more sort of kind of empirical criticism of like ways that we could change things that, you know, they're providing us reasons to think that this would better help animals if we did things differently. And there just didn't really seem to be much in the book that was like that. One exception I will flag, I think a really good chapter of the book was talking about, I think it was the influence of some of sort of cage-free campaigns in India, I think it was. And the author there was flagging that this was in communities where there were actually kind of very good, kind of very naturally raised kinds of found animal products available that people could get. And then by coming in and trying to advertise these like more factory farmed but cage free things as having the like seal of approval,
yeah.
it could push people towards buying these actually very inferior kind of products in terms of animal welfare compared to the more sort of natural alternatives that were available to them. So I do think that's a case where like, yeah, it seems really important that the people sort of funding these things are aware of the alternatives on the ground, and whether in trying to push something that's slightly better than the very worst factory farmed things, you're still actually ending up pushing people towards something that's worse than what they otherwise could have gotten. So that seems a very important kind of consideration to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good argument that is being made, that we perhaps have a kind of lack of knowledge of non-Western languages, and there's just a disconnect where we might not get as much information off the ground. And there certainly, I think the activist argument is a very good one, that we should try to establish connections so we can listen to the voices on the ground, because there's a lot to learn.
Absolutely. I mean, the local knowledge is just so crucial for being able to actually achieve the goals. And so I think that's absolutely right.
I mean, when it comes to, say, animal farming, most of the suffering probably is now in countries like, say, China, which has this massive farmed animal agriculture. Of course, the US probably very similar still, but at least thinking more about the future, I think countries like China and India, their farming is growing at a much more fast rate towards these industrial practices. So thinking about how we can impact policy there might be much more important than thinking about the more marginal improvements in Western countries.
Yeah, that sounds plausible.
Yeah, to go back to the AI question, perhaps with long-termism, when we think about future people, because it seems to me, say, in a way, it's just similar to trying not to be racist. You're trying to not be discriminatory against future people. So I can't really get behind the argument that future people shouldn't be perhaps be important at all. And even if you give them some discounting, because of the numbers, that's still going to outweigh current human interests a lot. But perhaps is there a worry that then future interests could just outweigh our own current interests completely, and we would have to sacrifice ourselves or future populations?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there is a worry in that vicinity. So so one question here is just sort of how far you're going to sort of care about what's morally ideal. So, you know, if you're a full-blown sort of utilitarian, you might well think, you know, it could be worth putting everyone alive today into sort of horrible circumstances if that would lead to a vastly better future for all the generations that follow. And I think maybe a lot of people would think that maybe that was unjust if it made us like worse off. You should have more attention to the worst off, and so they disagree with the utilitarian about that. Or they might just think it was too demanding. Even if it would be the best thing to do, it's not what we're required to do. We don't have to sacrifice our entire lives to help others. But again, this is where we need to stress that effective altruism doesn't require you to go all the way to utilitarianism. So, you know, you can still have like, you know, 90% of your life focused on helping you and your family and your friends. It's just saying, you know, have some non-trivial sort of concern, you know, maybe like 10% of your efforts and resources going to try to do as much good as possible. And I think having 10% of our efforts going to make a better future doesn't sound so outrageous.
Did you see this Netflix movie about the comet and Leonardo DiCaprio, Jennifer Lawrence?
Oh, is this the Don't Look Up one? I didn't actually see it.
Don't Look Up. Well, the whole it was politically very criticized by people on the right. So, this is outrageous, with it being depicted as idiots for not trying to prevent. But yeah, comparing climate change with a comet is perhaps a good idea, because sometimes effective altruists are criticized for perhaps neglecting climate change against something like AI risk, because climate change might make future lives much worse, but it's probably not leading to the complete extinction of humanity. Whereas something like a comet probably would just kill us all. But then are there attempts to create something or put money to interplanetary defense, that we in the future can shoot rockets against these comets to derail them? That seems for a long-termist, it seems like we should spend much more budget on that than we currently do for governments and the like.
Yeah, I mean, I think people have looked into it. My sense is that the general sense is that actually sort of NASA is reasonably on top of things in terms of keeping track of near Earth asteroids and such. And so there's not much risk to us in the sort of foreseeable future. But certainly in principle, if it wasn't, then I think that would actually be a top priority of effective altruists to make sure that we were tracking those objects and making sure that we were prepared if there was one that was going to wipe us out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be really important. Absolutely. Fortunately, it's not as neglected as you might have thought. So I think we're going to be okay on that front.
So we don't need something like an international space agency funded by EA, perhaps?
It doesn't seem like it yet, as far as I know.
Well, that's good. Yeah, about climate change, do you think it's justified to say that EAs have not given enough attention to that?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think one way of thinking about this is to notice that the sort of classic EA framework for thinking about what we should focus on is to look at importance, neglectedness, and tractability. And climate change is very important,
right?
But in scale, not as important as preventing something that literally wipes us out, right? So as you noted, there's a really big difference between climate change and something like an asteroid impact or AI gone completely rogue. So it's important, but moderated in its scale. It's not remotely neglected, right? It's like one of the most prominent political issues in the world. And so it's just a bit unclear how much more of an impact EAs could make on the margins there, given how much attention is already being paid to the issue. And then there's the questions about tractability as well. So, I mean, I do think EAs have looked into it a bit, and there's sort of, I think, support for some organizations that work in climate. So I've seen people recommending the Clean Air Task Force as one that does some quite good work in the area, partly politically focused again. So this is a sort of a tie into effective altruists supporting systemic change, where this seems like an organization that's quite good at doing things like lobbying to try to make governments invest more in green and sort of clean energy, green options, and doing other kinds of regulations that could help to reduce carbon emissions effectively. And so has those kinds of tie-ins that I think are interesting. It's not a top priority. It doesn't tend to get as much attention in general as the other main areas, animal welfare, global poverty, and existential risk, because it just isn't.
Right. So the idea is
it just doesn't score as highly on the importance, neglectedness, tractability framework as those other areas.
Like extra millions spent on trying to, say, fight climate change would just do very little, I guess, then.
That's the worry. I mean, I think it could do some significant good, but just compared to the amount that can be achieved by spending extra millions on these other areas, it's not quite as a higher priority as the thought. I don't know how robust those verdicts are.
But you think it's wrong to say that effective altruists don't care about climate change?
That's definitely wrong. Yeah. I mean, effective altruists are cause agnostic. There is, I think, literally nothing in the world that effective altruists strictly don't care about. It's that we try to kind of allocate our concern in proportion to the magnitude of the problem and its tractability and neglectedness. And so they come to the judgment that that climate change may not be as high a priority as some of the other issues. But that's a recent judgment that people can disagree about. It's not refusing to think about it or total neglect.
So what about the criticism that you see on social media, as well as perhaps the recent book criticizing effective altruism, that effective altruism, qua trying to measure these things in order to make them comparable, is then end up neglecting perhaps factors that can't be measured or are very difficult to measure? Yeah.
So I'm pretty skeptical of that critique. Partly because it fits very poorly with the sort of simultaneous critique people make that effective altruists are focusing too much on things like AI risk and these very speculative things, which are completely unmeasurable. I mean, there's no way to like really rigorously and confidently assess how much good is supporting this research into AI safety going to do. It's a complete moonshot. And I think that shows that effective altruists are very open to, unknown moonshots, as long as there's a sufficiently good basis for thinking, this is a really serious problem. There's some grounds for thinking that this could help address it. And so on the general importance, neglectedness, tractability framework, it scores well. And so I think that's, given that example, that there is clear support within effective altruism, at least in some quarters, for doing things that are very speculative. The criticism that it only ever considers things that are supported by randomized controlled trials is just clearly not true as a universal claim. It might be that within the area of global health and development in particular, because we would prefer to have more evidential support rather than less, given that we have found some charities that we can be very confident are doing immense amounts of good there. And there's no really grounds for speculation that there's some other charity that could be doing like 1,000 times better or 1,000,000 times better, the way that sort of X-risk speculations support. There, it just sort of makes sense, given our evidential base and the importance, neglectedness, tractability framework, to focus on the things that are really safe bets. But I think it would be a mistake to go from effective altruists are focusing on really safe bets within global health and development to the conclusion that, therefore, they're not even willing to consider anything that's speculative or not a safe bet. That just doesn't follow. And it's not empirically true of the movement. They do consider very speculative things when there's a good, when there's an argument for it.
So what about, say, because it seems like that argument mostly comes from the political left side.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it comes from the political right, really. Maybe there's an argument that there shouldn't be any, say, aid be given to other countries. You should just keep that in their own countries. But that's probably not being taken very serious at all.
No,
but
I don't think
couldn't
so.
there be an argument like, say, living in countries that have racial discrimination in subtle ways, or gender discrimination in these more subtle ways that perhaps aren't as obvious anymore to compare, say, 20 years ago, that they are still very harmful. And then people on the political right say something like, oh, we had a black president, racism is gone, or something, right? That here, there's still a lot of progress that has to be made, but it's hard to quantify that, perhaps, the harms that are created by having these racial gender injustices, perhaps still. Could there be an argument made like this, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think people do definitely try to make arguments along these lines. I mean, I guess my response to it is to think that even if you can't like really precisely quantify, you can at least do back of the envelope, very rough ballpark kind of figures to try to get a sense of, how bad is racial discrimination? How many people, like, what's the scope of it? How many people are affected? What are the chances of being able to make a difference if one were to like invest in more activism in this area? And so I think just any kind of way of trying to, these will be very vague numbers in a sense, like there's not like obviously one precise answer as to what those correct values are. But even if you came up with a very broad range just to try to get ballpark estimates of anything in that area, I just think my suspicion, I haven't done the calculations, but just my suspicion is that it would be hard to make those kind of social justice activism causes kind of competitive in a cost effectiveness way to things like saving people from dying of malaria for $5,000 or less. I mean,
what about perhaps factors like education? So one great benefit of education compared to, say, saving lives is that if you educate people in, say, poor countries, that might have downstream effects where then this country generates more economic revenue, is able to invest more into hospitals and the like. Could that be something that's being neglected by effective altruists, that we should try to create more schools, say, in Africa, and try to also get girls to school rather than just boys?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's possible. I mean, I think you'd need to sort of look into the details and make the argument. I mean, interestingly, education is one that was quite looked into early on by GiveWell and other effective altruist organizations. And my sense is that what they found is that it's just very difficult to make progress. Like in terms of the tractability, it's very hard for outside donors to come in and do anything that will actually lead to better educational outcomes. The things you might think would be helpful, like buy them textbooks that they're missing, or have more funding for smaller class sizes. It just seems like the evidence doesn't support the idea that that actually makes a huge difference. Rather, it seems that the very best educational outcome, the sort of most cost-effective way of improving education in many developing countries that's been found so far, is fund deworming medications so that their kids aren't suffering from intestinal parasites, which obviously interferes with their education. So that's an interesting kind of like not what you would have expected as being like the top education charity, but actually effective altruist investigation suggested maybe that's one of our best bets. I mean, there's a lot of controversy over deworming. There's that, you can look into the worm wars. People argue about how effective it really is, but there's at least some evidence to suggest it could make a big difference there. And I think that was part of the motivation for effective altruists early on, focusing quite significantly on deworming as a major cause area. But more generally, I think you're absolutely right that the focus on ripple effects, on thinking about not just about the immediate measurable impact, but about what could plausibly lead to better results in the long term, is really important, very valuable. And I think this, I think effective altruists are aware of that and want to measure it when they can and get some evidence about what will help long-term results. But it is hard to do. And so partly it might partly end up being based on just kind of your prior assumptions about what's likely to do long-term good. And I think a general worry a lot of effective altruists have is that sort of historically, when you look at people's trying to put ideas into practice that was just based on assumptions that this seems like it could do good, just often doesn't pan out. And so given that track record within the area of global health and development especially, it seems like we've got extra reason to really want something that does have a sort of evidential basis of support for thinking this isn't going to be counterproductive, rather this is actually going to achieve the results we want. But one thing that I think is very robustly good is saving people's lives, ensuring that they're in good health. Those are things that have good positive ripple effects. Is actually, I think, one of the most interesting arguments for supporting global health and development over just animal welfare, where if you were just focused on near-term expected value for reducing suffering, it seems like animal welfare charities might be 100 to 1,000 times more cost-effective. But the human-centric ones are going to have more ripple effects, plausibly, as the people whose lives you saved go on and do good things with their lives. Whereas reducing the suffering of factory farmed animals, very important, but it doesn't lead to ripple effects in quite the same way, or at least not as obviously.
Yeah, perhaps one example might be internet access. Do you think that could be a good EA funded area, perhaps, say, investing in some rural areas in Asia, Africa, South America?
It's very possible. I wouldn't want to rule it out. I feel a little bit out of my depth trying to just speculate on what good things for the world might be, because I don't feel like I'm qualified
I guess
to speak
we should
to
ask developmental economists.
Exactly.
They probably know better.
Right.
Yeah, to move back then to the AI question, which perhaps is now the most controversial issue in EA. Who was it? Steven Pinker, I think, recently made a tweet that he was very closely EA aligned, but now he thinks they've become so focused on AI and global human extinction that he can no longer go and support it in the same way.
Yeah, it's too weird for him. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to say in response to that, except that I sort of wonder what's the supporting argument for completely dismissing existential risks. It just seems like if there's some chance that the world really is in danger, then we should probably pay attention to that. If you could be absolutely certain that the concerns were overblown, then sure, you can safely dismiss it. But if you're somewhat agnostic, I mean, I'm very agnostic about the issue. I'm not an AI expert. I don't have grounds for confidence either way. It seems like a lot of respectable people, including people who do know a lot about AI, do think there's a serious risk there, like a non-trivial one. So it makes me think, well, I should probably give it at least some credence. If I was like more confident than like 99.99% that everything was going to be okay, then that would seem like really overconfident, right? It would be hubristic to be that certain that everything's okay when there are experts saying, no, there's a real concern we should look into more. That makes me think, no, we should look into it more and play things safe. I like to be prudent.
Yeah, it seems like among the critics, they often try to perhaps ridicule EAs there for their stance, while at the same time very confidently asserting a level of risk and the chance of whatever their hypotheses are. But yeah, it seems like the more neutral stance, even if you assign a tiny probability to AI taking over and realizing in order to achieve a particular goal given to me by humans, the best way of doing this is exterminating humans.
Right.
even with a tiny risk, we should probably still invest quite a bit in trying to prevent that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just think some degree of precautionary measures just seems very sensible. So I do find the criticisms there puzzling. I mean, I think, if you were putting, 90% of the world's resources towards this sort of speculative stuff, that would seem overdoing it, right? But we're currently at a tiny little percentage, and so it doesn't seem like a terrible idea to want to boost that a bit.
Is it perhaps though too much of the, say, EA budget going into AI, would you say?
I don't really know. I mean, I don't have a lot of sort of confidence about like trying to pronounce on what the right balance of consideration should be here. I mean, I think there's an interesting question of should you want the EA budget to be allocated according to like what would be ideal if the entire world was following the same budget? Or should we want it to be doing what will do the most marginal good given what's currently neglected? And obviously effective altruism supports the latter kind of reasoning, not the former. So although I probably wouldn't want the whole like the world's global budget to be allocated in the same way that the EA one currently is, and I think most EAs would agree, because once the budget was increased that much, you'd have differences in terms of what organizations have room for more funding. Diminishing returns would lead to very different results. But given how neglected it currently is, sort of existential risks in general, I'm generally supportive of having a significant amount of effort go into addressing that.
So it might be that in, say, 10 years of having 4 EAs being involved in AI research and really trying to push ethics into this field, which is perhaps lacking, as something people should be more concerned about. Yeah, perhaps in the even near-term future, there will be solutions such as, oh, well, you just have to ensure that these principles are followed in the design of AI systems or general artificial intelligences. And then we can be fairly confident that we won't get existential risk from AIs.
Yeah, that would be great,
right?
If they can solve it and then just shift the funding to other causes, like that would be fantastic.
Because presumably this isn't an area where you just have to spend ongoing amounts of money. Presumably at some point you'll more or less settle it.
Yeah,
unless you need something like
if AI itself is developed within a few decades, then presumably either it'll be sufficiently well aligned with human interests that we survive, or it won't, and so we'll have our answer one way or the other.
Yeah, then perhaps to move to the final question. So sometimes CAs talk about this value lock-in. Could you describe that more?
Yeah, so the basic idea of value lock-in, I think, is this worry about current sort of values, or at least some particular value set, being then sort of strictly enforced, being locked in and enforced on society. And maybe the easiest way of seeing how this could happen would be via AI, if it ended up sort of taking over the world in some sense, either directly or indirectly by supporting a dictatorship or something. Some very powerful people end up having a lot of power as a result of AI supporting them, then that could lock in their values and priorities and kind of shape the rest of the future according to what was programmed into the controlling AI. So I mean, it sounds very sci-fi. Whenever you're thinking about like what's the future going to look like in 50 or 100 years, it's the future is fictional from our current perspective. But I think there's at least a possibility that it could end up being very shaped by these sort of AI algorithms that are going to have a lot of power. And so what sort of values they end up being sort of aligned to promote, if it's something that's very fixed, could end up, the worry is that it's not going to have the right kind of morally exploratory kind of features to it that we think is important for making moral progress. So the general worry is if you look in particular values, and then this is what is sort of, the whole world is structured by this as a result of the AI having so much power and control. One thing it could do is things like ensure that people don't deviate from those particular values. So if you think you have the right values, imagine that you could like successfully brainwash the next generation of people, or require that society continue to be governed by these values. There's just not room for progress anymore once it's locked in. So that, I think that's the general lock-in worry, is that we think it's really important to have moral progress, to realize that our current values are probably mistaken in some respects. And so one thing that's important is to try to think about how can we maintain a morally exploratory world, a world in which people can disagree with the prominent values, think about ways they could be improved upon. And so having that kind of openness and sort of broadly liberal ideal seems really important moving forwards. And there's just a general worry that I think the development of AI as a technology especially could enforce a bit more of a sort of totalitarian society where there wasn't that openness to questioning the society's foundational values.
I mean, that seems very much to take seriously the charge of potentially locking in, say, very capitalist, pro-capitalist values, that actually we should be open to the potential of criticizing them in the future, perhaps trying to find better improvements. That's actually something AIs then take quite serious.
Yeah, no, that's right. So that might be a way of sort of making common cause with a lot of our more leftist critics, would be to sort of highlight that possibility as one where, you know, it seems like you can probably agree that this would be a danger.
Yeah, perhaps then there is not as much, say, conflict there as sometimes is made out to be. Right. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on this podcast. It's great to talk about effective altruism, trying to understand it better, trying to perhaps explain it more to the public, what it even means and what the main criticisms and arguments about it are. I hope that's helpful for the viewers. Thanks again for coming on.
All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for the listeners, and I hope we'll see you again. Bye.